Hi, everyone. That was a wonderful introduction, far better than anything that I could have written. So I think the edits are much appreciated. Swami Yogatmananda asked me to talk about this because the relationship between the individual and society, and what happens when we decide to live in society or decide not to, is something that I think quite a bit about professionally. Today's talk, which I'm very thankful to be able to give and to talk to you about, is really going to try to create some confusion, because I tend to think confusion can be very productive, especially when it comes from sources that we take as authoritative. And I think that we'll see if I'm successful at all at the end of the talk, and progress accordingly. So thank you again for coming to listen. Thank you for the chance to talk. The topic that I'm going to talk about today is this relationship between the individual and society. So these are terms I think that we use quite often. We think we know what they mean. I think each of us has some meaning that we take from it. And you could even say some of us, especially if you're young, maybe in your teenage years, maybe in college, and procrastinating in the library as I was, you're thinking about what this relationship is, what your role in society should be. I won't give any answers, but I'll try to go through my understanding of some of Swami Vivekananda's writings and speeches and hopefully start a discussion about it. The context of this talk is that it was preceded by a short comment that I had made to Swami Yogatmananda saying about a particular story that appears in one of Swami Vivekananda's in one of the chapters of his complete works in Karma Yoga, in which he describes how a family of birds sacrifices themselves in a fire when hungry people find themselves there wet at night with nothing to eat. So this is where this topic, this is where it came from. That story will also come up. So we all have our ideas of what these terms mean, what individual means, what society means, and maybe even what spiritual means. For example, you might think you're an individual, I'm an individual. Society maybe is when we leave here and we hear babies crying, or we have to do things for other people, or we're prevented from doing some things by other people. You kind of feel that maybe that's society. And spiritual could be what you feel when you're sitting here, or maybe the reason you come to the Vedanta Center, or maybe you're drawn to Vedanta, whatever it is. But let's set out some general ideas about these terms that will appear in the rest of this talk. This dichotomy between the individual and society, this assumption that these are different things, underlies much of philosophy, Eastern and Western, especially practical religion, that is, religion that pertains to everyday action. And the difference between religion and the spiritual, as I'll use it in this talk, is religion tells you what to do. Spiritual might not necessarily tell you what to do. In fact, it might say, figure it out for yourself. Practical religion, I use this term to refer to religion that relates to everyday action. Be charitable. Do this and don't do that. Be nice, don't be mean. Treat others as you might want to be treated. So these statements that tell you how you might want to behave. And this dichotomy, again, between the individual and society, that these are different things, and therefore we have to think about the relationship between them, even underlies social science, or what we call social science. But immediately two questions come up. So if you say, okay, the individual and society are different things, related but different things, then the first question is, what is one's relationship to society? If I'm separate, if I'm different from it, maybe I'm a part of it, but I'm different from it, what is my relationship to it? And the second question is, what should be my relationship to society? And these are different questions. What is it, and what should it be? I don't use the word, we didn't use the word individual here when we were phrasing these two questions, because individual is very abstract. You say there's an individual. And it suggests this abstraction that everybody is similar in some way. It assumes that different people have at least one common characteristic. From our everyday experience, though, these two questions, what is one's relationship to society and what should be one's relationship to society, can be very personal. We have our own circumstances. We understand it in a very personal way. In fact, if we think about it, these seem to be very timeless questions. It seems like people have been asking this for a long time. You could imagine your parents asking this question at some point. You could imagine your parents' parents asking this question at some point. Indeed, you can imagine that this conflict between individual desires and group demands, what you might want to do as an individual, and this conflict between what society wants you to do, or the group of people that you live with want you to do, or sometimes people you don't want to live with want you to do, goes as far back as when human beings started living in groups. But keep in mind again that, and I think it's that all of this, everything that I've said, in fact, the title of the talk itself presumes that there's a difference between the individual and society. Now, the fact of emphasizing it so much almost might make you think, well, am I going to say it's not the case? Well, no, I think it's a reasonable presumption. By all practical considerations, it's reasonable to think that. Here's a small test. So who among us says that the individual is the same as society? Anyone? Yeah, I mean, it's reasonable because if you do, why not take all of the money that you have in your bank account and distribute it to the first people that you see? As soon as we think about doing this, we realize, no, I think about myself as different from these. Otherwise, what would be the difference of me having this money and everybody else having this money? So the question really is a real one. But perhaps because it appears to be a timeless question, there are several perspectives on it. The one that we'll focus on here is the perspective of Vedanta, which we call the spiritual perspective in this talk. So I'll use this interchangeably. More precisely, this is the perspective of Swami Vivekananda, as recorded in his writings and as understood by this speaker. To contrast and compare these views, we'll use the Western perspective to mean this range of perspectives that a student at an American university studying right now might normally be taught in an undergraduate education, and with which we are probably familiar, if not by studying it ourselves, then by practicing it or engaging with people who have learned this. So let's see how easily, so that we can see how easily this question of individual and society and its relationship can cause confusion, let's try to generate some confusion in our minds using Swami Vivekananda's own words. And then let's see if we can try to find a way out. In one place, he says, each is great in his own place, but the duty of one is not the duty of the other. And then he illustrates this through a story of birds and a king and a sannyasi and a princess. How many are familiar with this story? If not, I can recount it. If you are familiar, please raise your hand. Okay, so most are not. So let me recount the story. The crux of the story is that because of various circumstances, a king and a sannyasi, someone who's renounced the world, find themselves in a forest. And they're looking at another sannyasi. Well, actually, this is the sannyasi. They're looking at a princess who ends up lost in the forest. And they too are there in the forest. And they're under a tree seeking refuge. And it's nighttime. There's nothing to eat. They're very hungry. They've lit a fire. And there's a family of birds in the tree. A mother bird, a father bird, and two chicks. So the father bird says, guests have come to our house. How can we let them go hungry? There's nothing to eat. And as soon as he says this, he jumps into the fire in order to provide his own meat for these guests to eat. The mother bird says, my goodness, my husband has just jumped into the fire. It's my duty as the wife to support anything my husband wants to do. Therefore, I will also jump into the fire and help in what he started. His intention was to feed these guests, so let me jump into the fire too. Then the chicks see their parents having been burned in the meat, they can probably smell it, and they think, what should we do? And they jump into the fire too. And the story ends by this sannyasi who's explaining to this king who observed this. And he says, each is great in his own place. Okay. So let's think about that for a minute. So who are these? When they say each, it's referring to the birds, maybe to the observers, and is great in their own place. And you think, because of the shocking nature of this thing that they just saw, you think, whose place is what? Where did this idea of this place come from? In fact, when the sannyasi in the story says these words, each is great in his own place, but the duty of one is not the duty of the other, you imagine that Swami Vivekananda is saying it himself, because the story ends right there. And that's all fine and good, because it seems to say we all have duties, they might be unique, and we should do them. But if we take these views literally, we still need further guidance. I mean, we started with this question, what is one's relationship to society and what should it be? This story alone is not enough, because you think, what is my place? Who told these birds that their place was to jump into this fire? They could very well have said it's God's plan to allow these people to starve. They didn't, and they had some other understanding of it. And so this question, what is my place, arises immediately. What is my duty also arises. And in the case of the story, who told them that was their duty? How do they develop this understanding? And then if we take this personally, you say, then who can tell me this? Who can tell me what my place is in society? What is my duty? And then if somebody should tell you, that's not enough either, because you have to know, how do I know if this person is right? What authority does this person have to tell me what my duty is in society? And if it's a situation that's as stark as the birds, you're wondering, it's a question of sacrificing myself for other people to eat. I better be pretty sure that the person who's telling me to do this has the authority to do so. And then further questions would arise. Do they know this person, they meaning this person who's telling me my duty, do they know my particular circumstances? They may have some great grand command of philosophy. Do they know my particular situation? Do they know the details of my relationships with the people around me? And do they have all of the relevant detail to be able to tell me what my duty is? And then there are other questions. Does my duty change? I spoke to this person last week. They told me this was my duty. Some of my circumstances have changed. Should I go and consult them again to figure out what my new duty is in these new set of circumstances? Does it change with circumstance? Does it change with age? Do I have different duties as I get older, as I get married, and so on? Do I have different duties if I'm a scholar, if I'm not? And then there are infinitely many other variables that could lead to doubts. So this question, is it constant? Is my duty constant? And if it's changing, does it mean I have to seek guidance every time I want to do something? Or is there some discretion that I have? And who's qualified to tell me? These questions don't go away. Even if you're to say each is great in its own place, but the duty of one is not the duty of the other, these questions will come up. So even if we let's suppose, yes, one has a place, one learns somehow what one's place is, and there are people qualified to guide you, there's still a more pressing question, which comes up when, particularly, the duty that you're prescribed is difficult. The first question is, why do I have to do this again? Why should we do our duty? And here we might imagine that we play some role in society, and you're needed for the functioning of this great thing, this great machine that's called society and human civilization. And if I don't do my duty, there's going to be something missing. Or in other words, another description that's very common is we are different organs in this body of society. Is this the answer? Is this the resolution? Well, let's go to Swami Vivekananda again. And he says, in another place, our duty means helping others. But if we consider well, we find that the world does not require our help at all. So each is great in his own place. The duty of one is not the duty of the other. Our duty means helping others, but the world doesn't need it. So what to make of this? Let's go back to this last question. When things get difficult, what is the basis of doing your duty then? What is the basis of something you've already accepted as your duty? So, having said this, and if we are different organs of this wonderful thing called society, then none of us are vital organs. And instead, Vivekananda goes further. Swami Vivekananda, and he says, we may all be perfectly sure, and he says this so categorically, we may all be perfectly sure that it will go on beautifully well without us. You could kill yourself, and society would go on. Okay. So if this is the case, then why should we do our duties again? And furthermore, a more basic question is, why are there duties at all? So this question really lies at the center of this idea of the individual and society. You have duties. There are things you ought to do, apparently, but society, the greater society, doesn't need you to do those things. So when it gets very difficult, why do them? And this appears to be a contradiction right there. So we've succeeded in creating confusion using Swami Vivekananda's own words. On one side, one has duties to society, which implies that one should do them. Recall the story of the birds. And on the other side, you're not necessary for society to function. So why do them? So even when we seek spiritual guidance from Swami Vivekananda through his own words on the question of the individual and society, it doesn't seem we've moved much further than what we encounter in our everyday material lives. This is a confusion that's everywhere. And for example, we get a summons asking us to attend jury duty. Or we're said to have duties to our parents, for example. We're required to do them, and normally we don't hesitate to do them, but sometimes when it gets difficult, we're kind of like, man, do I really have to do that? Or we're said to have, but the point that I want to make here is that the logic behind these duties can be understood very simply. You don't need these grand spiritual ideas to be able to make sense of this. And the logic, or one possible logic, is in order for a group of people to maintain a system, either a system of justice or a family, each person has to behave in a certain way. And who behaves in what way, sometimes as a result of discussion, sometimes it's just a function of power. Somebody is more powerful than you are and tells you what to do. You're not powerful enough to say no. Now, if one or two people deviate, the system might not be harmed so much. But if many people deviate, it might pose a great danger to these systems. And in fact, these may be systems that we depend on. Like jury duty. If everybody said we're not going to do jury duty as a group, that's our principle, then this idea that justice is administered by the polity, the democratic polity, faces problems. It'll be a judge deciding. It won't be a group of people selected from society. So, as someone trained in the social sciences, I can assure you that sometimes it can be very, very difficult for a group of people to work together. Even for simple things, like sharing a bathroom in a house. If you've lived with roommates, you know what I'm talking about. When it comes, normally you clean it, it's fine. When exam time comes around, who's going to clean the bathroom? You're up all night, have had coffee, you're high on coffee. Who's going to take out the trash? Okay. Now imagine you have to get different generations of people to work together, and it gets even more difficult. And the logic of social duties is not very different from trying to solve this problem, getting people to work together in a system. In a way, we can say that this idea of social duty that we encounter encodes a certain logic, and we don't have to think very much about why to do something or why not. It's just you do it, everything works. We don't have to think about it too much. It's enough if we understand what has to be done and if we do it. And then we have this sense that, yeah, things will function, I can focus on things that I care about, and this other stuff will go on. But this question, there's still a question here. Okay, duties, there's the logic and so on, but this question of who should do what duties, or in Swami Vivekananda's words, the question of what one's place is still unresolved. Okay, society needs people to do various things in order to function. Who does what? One way to do this and assign these tasks is, by the way, keep in mind, not all tasks are equally desirable, as we know. Cleaning the bathroom, well, sometimes it can be very pleasant and sometimes it cannot be very pleasant. But this question is still unresolved. Now, one way to do this and say, you do this, I'll do this, is for the powerful or the wealthy to take on the more prestigious duties. I'll be the ruler, I'll be the judge, I'll be the priest, I'll be the general, and you guys are going to do the labor-intensive work. You'll clean the buildings, you'll do the construction, you'll clean the sewers, and so on. Ancient India is littered with this. Modern India is littered with this. Many societies are littered with this. I don't want to conjecture too far, but no matter where you go, you'll see this. The logic of this allocation. And the type of reasoning behind why some people have to do certain jobs or asked to do certain jobs or roles, let's say, and others, can easily lead over time to what we might now recognize as a rigid system of castes, for example, whether you call it by that name or you don't call it by that name. But are there other ways to allocate jobs other than somebody powerful saying, here, you do this and I'll do this? And then another question, should people move freely between jobs? I'll clean the bathroom one day, I'll take out the trash another day, or I'll work as a janitor for 6 months of the year and I'll work as a CEO for the remaining 6. Should they be trained to do certain jobs and not others? Who should pay for this training? How much should people be taxed to pay for this training, if that's how it's going to be? Who decides how this money is going to be spent, and so on? A whole range of questions. This realm is the realm of social science, politics, power, economics, human desires, conflict, and all of their attendant debates. You can already recognize this as I lay out these questions as the plumbing of any society, of any complex grouping of people trying to work together. Here, the non-spiritual education has a lot to say. And suffice to say, research continues. It's why many of us professional academics have our jobs. Indeed, this external organization of society, who does what, how it's allocated, what's fair, what's not, is the primary focus of the educations that we're likely to receive at any modern university. Indeed, when we turn to Swami Vivekananda looking for answers to these questions, we find contradictions. For his belief, as reflected in his writings, is that the world can't be straightened out. Forget about it. And this is a quote of his. He says, people have been striving to straighten it out for hundreds of years, but when they let go, it's curled back up again. In a way, he's saying, don't look to me for this answer about how you're going to organize society and who's going to do these jobs and how the politics should be organized and so on and so forth. And so it seems this question of how society should be, this grouping of people should be, a grouping of individuals should be, the spiritual doesn't seem to have an answer. Indeed, the entire focus is framed around this acceptance that the world has its own nature, which is beyond any of us to alter eternally, yet we do have far greater control over our own actions than we do over society, and the manner in which we do these actions is also completely under our control. Furthermore, it's this manner in which we do these actions that has a lasting effect on us. It may not be on society, but it has a lasting effect on us. And so Swami Vivekananda says it's not the receiver that is blessed, but the giver. And to the extent that we shape society, we shape or influence those around us. And this, what Swami Vivekananda calls the secret of work, is to do whatever tasks we have in an unattached manner. So that the question of how society should be, it's almost turned back upon the individual. And another way to say this is that one should act so that we don't expect a result. Why? Because the world owes us nothing. This is why Vivekananda's phrase. You do stuff, but what does the world owe you that it's going to give you something in return? And furthermore, what does the world owe you that it's going to give you back what you expected when you did that task? All right. And he says, nor is the world waiting for our help. These are his words. So then why help others? But he still says your duty is to help others. Okay. Then why do it? The world doesn't need you. You can't straighten it out. No matter what you do, it's not going to last forever. And then there's a little clue in that how you do something affects you profoundly, but we're trying to think about society and our relationship to it. So still, it's not clear. The answer that he gives is that the act of helping in an unattached manner, that is without expecting a return, you're helping but you're not expecting a return, is a spiritual exercise. That is the spiritual exercise. And this same act, regardless of what it is, when done with a different mindset, that is, when done with an attached mindset, it would be foolish. That's what Swami Vivekananda would say. So somehow we've reached this point of how you do the things that you do. So we've avoided this question of why some people do some things and others, and we've thought, okay, none of us have nothing to do. In other words, all of us have something to do. We can't sit still in a room and say, I'm not going to do anything. In fact, try it. If you last an hour, I'll buy you dinner. So we already have some sense there's something to do, and recognizing this, the question is, how should one do it? And that's how the question seems to turn. So keep in mind that we've reached this far without specifying what duty we're talking about here. We haven't said who should do what the right duties are, how people in society, individuals in society should behave in order to live well in society, and so on. But the common denominator across all duties is the fact of having to do them. Every duty has to be done, as we've said earlier. And this feeling that we have to do it is also common across human beings, especially those who live in society. Although the thing to be done might be different across people and across societies and so on. And at the same time, all of us have some sense of what is good and what is bad. And consequently, what a sin is and who a sinner is. And so when the rules are so clear that they can say, this is bad, this is good, this is a sin, this is not, this is what you should do, this is what you should not do, living in society is quite simple. There's no real question about the relationship between the individual and society. Avoid the bad things, do the good things, avoid the sins, and don't be a sinner, and you'll be good. Just go forward. When the rules are this clear, it's simple. But from a spiritual perspective, the idea of sin and sinner is itself arbitrary and changeable. So the basis of these rules would be arbitrary, which is quite a dramatic thing to say if you're living in society and you're following certain rules. And they're changeable. Over time, these rules will change. So what you think might be a duty now might not be considered a duty in future. So even if the rules are set, even if there are duties to be done, even if living in society is simple, in that regard, just follow the rules. What actions we think are good and bad and necessary or not change over time. And so can that really be the basis of a spirituality? This is a question that underlies this. And so most duties are ever changing and they change along with ideas of what a good society should be. In India and South Asia, it was thought that in a society to live well, women should play a certain role. That's changing. In the US, it was thought black people, African American people, should play a certain role. That's changing. So the direct question, avoiding all of this from a spiritual perspective, becomes how should one do one's duties? And how should one live in society? The question becomes, how should one live in society? In a more basic way, it's a question of how should one act? This is a very simple question. And that's why it at once seems so sometimes offensive, sometimes meaningless, sometimes filled with meaning. But once these how questions have been answered, you can still ask why. So the why question hasn't been resolved yet. Now, why should I even do it? So this new question in this spiritual perspective, as Swami Vivekananda lays it out, is said to lead to a deeper understanding, this question of how and why. And it addresses indirectly how society should be. That's not the main focus of this. It's how one should live in a given society. But once you move to this question of how one should do one's duties, you might develop a totally different understanding of society. And see this question that we started with about what one's duties are, and even this dichotomy between the individual and the society in a totally different way. And so this gradual dissolving of the boundary between myself and others is already suggested when Swami Vivekananda declares that one who does good to others does good to himself. But it's much more clearly articulated when he answers the question of what is real. When asked this question, what's real? You've said all these things, what's real? He declares, without ambiguity, that each one of us is exactly the same. Each one is the undying spirit, in his words. And so this is a view that one will find in common to nearly all spiritual paths. Of course, we can choose whether to believe Swami Vivekananda or not. That's up to us. But if we do, let's follow through with the implications of that view, of that declaration. So from this perspective, that we're all the same, the division between individuals and society is an illusion that we've maintained through a sort of hypnosis. We're lions and we think we are sheep. You've probably read this somewhere. We see a snake in a rope, and we see mere reflections on the surface of water, and we think it's real. These are not my words, but these are the words of people who we might consider spiritual, and therefore it reflects this spiritual perspective. And so the reasoning would go, as long as we're caught in this illusion of difference, we struggle with this question of individual and society. Once we're free of this illusion, well, who knows? We'd have to find out for ourselves. There's a suggestion that the question is understood differently. However, this fact cannot be avoided. At this moment, each of us, based on the question that I asked you in the beginning, each of us sees ourselves as different from society and even other individuals. Some may see this difference to a greater extent than others. Others may see that there's more similar. But there is a spiritual principle that we are bound to, which is that which we see inside, we see outside. That's again in Swami Vivekananda's own words. And this is a principle, an eternal principle that goes on and on. So at once we see a distinction, and it's implied that we see this distinction because there's something in us that leads us to do this. So according to this spiritual principle of that which we see inside, we see outside, we see divisions, we see society, we see that there must be a resolution between what I want to do and what others require from us. In fact, we create the question ourselves. On one front, when we're confronted with this question, which is reflecting this belief inside, on one front, we try to organize society, and we say this is how each person should behave and what the place of each person is. And we work. We may work to revolt, we may work to change that structure, whatever it is. We try to organize society externally. At the same time, the spiritual perspective suggests turning work into a gradual way out of the hypnosis. This hypnosis that led to the question in the first place. So as we see ourselves on the spiritual side as less and less different from those around us, the question of the individuals in society becomes less pressing because the dichotomy appears less stark. So it's reasonable to think that this deeper understanding should bring people closer together about what the goals of society should be, but naturally it'll lead to different recommendations for how society should be organized. if human history has anything to teach us, we could still think we're exactly the same underneath, and this is what our goal should be. And if we look at human history, we'll see that even when we agree on these general goals, peace, prosperity, liberty, freedom, enlightenment, we tend to disagree about the paths. So this disagreement really doesn't go away, and the spiritual claim doesn't claim that this is going to go away. Despite that, one must act and make progress on that spiritual front. So we again find a universal piece of advice. The goal may be distant, but awake, arise, and stop not till the goal is reached. A very famous declaration by Swami Vivekananda. So then, in the end, what are we left with from the spiritual perspective, having gone through this? We're left with the knowledge of two dynamics, according to which we are to make our own decisions. This is again Swami Vivekananda saying, figure it out for yourself. And we're to use our own logic, and we're to use our own reasoning. And here are the dynamics. Externally, society has its own dynamic that we cannot change permanently. You're going to try to make it straight, it's going to curl. Internally, there are certain dynamics of attachment to what we do that we can't change. However, as we change our internal perspective, our view of the external will also change. And so our view of the relationship between society and the individual will also change, which is the question we started with. Will we be happier? Will we be more prosperous? Will we get rid of conflict and disagreement? Will our children be able to go to school? Will we get rid of poverty and injustice in the world? Probably not. And even if we do, it'll be momentary. Nevertheless, the spiritual perspective suggests that we must try to do good in the world with all our energies to alleviate the suffering of others, to help others. This provides not only a moral compass, but an opportunity to do work and to escape this hypnosis. And through this opportunity of work, to do work, and the doing of this work, we ourselves can be free. And that's where I'd like to end this talk. Thank you. I guess if I have any questions, should I take questions or? I left a little bit of time for questions in case I can answer anything. Yeah.
Do you agree that because the world is a curly tail, it teaches us constant vigilance?
I guess it could teach constant vigilance. I mean, there's a saying that Swami Vivekananda would attribute to Sri Ramakrishna. He would say, as long as I live, I learn. So I suppose yes.
As long as there's dust, we have to do dust.
Yep. So definitely there's this sense that just because it's going to curl up again doesn't mean you sit back and say there's nothing to be done.
What's the use of dust in the furniture?
Yeah.
It's only when the dust begins.
Yeah. Yeah, or an example that's familiar to college students, why make my bed? I'm going to have to sleep in it anyway at night. Yeah.
I was curious. I always assumed that the saying of begin with yourself is a way, a call to action. Because by walking the path, whether Vivekananda's idea of beginning with yourself, you will act in a way that will affect society, to some extent. Maybe not reacting in the way we do so in the West, tit for tat in a sense. But it will nevertheless get improve society by beginning with yourself. So I don't see Vivekananda in
Same.
his trust
Yeah.
that by beginning with yourself, beginning to try to understand the nature of your mind and your place and who you are, maybe in relation to a spiritual cosmos, still you can have an impact that is potentially non-attachedly positive in the way it impacts on the world.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think that this, what I'm saying here shouldn't be interpreted as sort of a call to inaction.
I agree.
It's definitely not a call to inaction. It's sort of, if we're looking for a basis for action, where would it come from? Of course, it's based on a particular reading of this. But my sense of that would be, if you expect that you're going to change the world, that's wrong.
I don't, but I actually still think as a teacher, when I see my students, I
Right.
think to myself, just wait till you grow up
Right.
and you realize there is no justice, you cannot change the world. However, begin with yourself,
Yeah.
and you will become part of that energy that
Yeah.
potentially could improve us as human beings. Because the other thing is that, which of course is also something that most of us have a hard time believing.
Yeah.
We are not unlike the other. We are much more so than different. Therefore, that fundamental human nature can indeed be affected by the bodhisattva nature of our action.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that the only thing in what I've said that would relate to that, I think, would be this idea of why you're doing what you're doing. You know, and this was kind of the thing that.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of in the same line, but you know, in our society, this is something I heard from somebody that imagine a society where you know there are people, good people, spiritual people, selfless people, so much of voluntary work. If you take that out, I mean, the society would be much worse.
Yeah.
So it's just another perspective. It's like there's so much of selfless effort that's going around that probably is not getting appreciated.
Yeah. But, yeah, there probably is. I think one of the striking things when I started coming to the Vedanta Center is, I mean, look around. I mean, how many African American people do you see here? Walk 5 blocks down and look at the composition of the neighborhoods. And I always wondered, why that difference? If this idea is to help others and to do this, what's happening? Maybe there are indirect ways of doing things. Maybe there's a different understanding. Maybe there are activities that are going on and so forth. So these are questions that I think constantly people can ask. What sort of activities should be considered charitable, and should the recognition be there? Should it remain hidden, and so on? I mean, these are, according to the distinction that I've tried to draw in this talk, there's this set of external questions that you can debate, and constantly it goes on and on and on. It's what gives people like me their jobs. Precisely because, you try to straighten it out and it works contextually. It doesn't work in some places, and there's no real right answer to this. It's oftentimes a function of who's more powerful than the other, who has the money and who doesn't, who controls the politics and who doesn't. And not that can't be changed, and not that we don't feel the impetus to change that. But the question is that variability a basis of spiritual action? And the distinction that I tried to draw was, if we try to understand Swami Vivekananda's works, which first appear contradictory when you're trying to approach these questions, the answer is no, it's not. I mean, as you work on yourself, the understanding changes, and we see the world with our own understandings. And then that would shape our actions, probably, in that way.
Actually, if we do not have the word change, but if we say there is some kind of intensification of life that one can bring to the world, like a musician
Yeah.
or an artist or maybe even a sportsman can intensify the oneself training or the self-relation, and that can transform the potential of that seeing that space. So if we don't have the word change and suffering, then how would this relationship stand?
Probably it might be that I don't think this perspective has anything to say about the nature of the action. It's probably, if you're helping others, it's good. That's as far as it goes. Why are you doing it? If you're doing it in order to make this a permanent revelation for society, probably, that's not going to form a basis of spiritual action. But if you're doing it in this sort of unattached kind of way, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing very well and to the best of my knowledge and abilities, that might be a basis for doing it according to the things that I've said here. So the focus again is the spiritual question avoids all of these questions about what's good to do and what's bad to do. I mean, Swami Vivekananda goes as far as saying help others, alleviate the suffering of others. But as you do it, you do it as an internal spiritual exercise. And in fact, that's where you can expect the result. Externally, it's very difficult to expect particular results. So I don't think it would have anything particular to say about the fact of doing it. But maybe it would have something to say about the mentality with which it's done, or the mindset with which it's approached personally. That's, I guess, yeah.
There's one question that I've always had with this business of non-attachment to the goal. Here the goal is the alleviation of suffering of the
Yeah.
others, and at the same time you're asked to not attach to that goal.
Yeah.
This can give rise to certain paradoxical situations
Right.
where you can convince yourself that you are helping someone else when you're actually doing them great harm. But since you have no desire to reflect on their responses to what you're doing, you can continue to convince yourself in an unattached fashion that what you're doing is actually beneficial when it does great harm. And I'm saying this because in our time we see so many instances of people, especially through the social sciences, through expert knowledge, people convinced that they're doing other people great good when they're doing them great harm. And the power of that conviction lies in the understanding that this is disinterested knowledge. It's not really. So, that can be a peculiar kind of way in which that unattached action ends up being the source of some discord and violence.
I think so. I think earlier when this topic came up, Swami Yogananda was asked about the Holocaust. And said, if it's the manner of working that matters, what do you have to say about that? And he had an answer there. I can speak from the social science, the example that you gave, the social science of this, thinking that this is what's good for society, researching that, trying to implement it in society, and in that context, what does unattached mean? Does unattached mean that what I'm doing should not be subject to feedback from other people, or shouldn't be improved, and so on? That's not the sense of unattached, I think, that comes across in these writings. It seems like the sense of unattachment is not being attached to the results. That is, I can see how it can be understood as saying, I don't care what happens. It's not that. There's something that I'm trying to achieve, and I'm doing it to the best of my ability and my knowledge. In fact, I should be judged by the extent to which I do that. But whether or not what I want to come about will come about, that's not going to alter. That attachment is what's going to determine whether it's a spiritual exercise or whether it's a purely material exercise. And I think that's the attachment to results, I think, is the emphasis here, this sort of internal attachment to results. Yeah, but I'm sure Swami Yogatmananda could give a better answer to this than I could. Yes.
I got here really late in the game, but it crossed my mind that the Vedanta Society and spiritual organizations created spiritual opening for the realization of self to take place. But on the societal side, you better be careful what you try to implement, because there are unintended consequences that you could not imagine. So most likely your individual being is the best, better choice for change.
Yeah. I think so. I think so. So the point was that doing things externally, there can be a lot of unintended consequences. Yeah. So, yeah. These external questions of how to organize society is very complex. And most of the time, what social scientists think should be done, if there's anything they think should be done, 30 years later, you realize that was a total mistake. But it doesn't stop you from doing it, and doesn't have uniform effects everywhere. But that's just the nature of sort of, you feel like you should do this to improve the world because you think there's injustice, and you act according to that. And of course, the world doesn't straighten out. Whether the fact of not straightening out improves what you do, and you're open to that or not, hopefully that's something people do. But whether I'm going to be completely depressed if the world doesn't change according to what I think it should be, maybe for a time, but then I'll probably say, let me open up Swami Vivekananda and read that the world is always curly. But, okay, I guess I'm out of time, so thank you.